The secret of Jesus' divinity. If you've ever sat down and read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, or Luke from beginning to end, one of the most striking things you might have noticed is how Jesus often instructs the demons, his disciples, and others not to tell anyone who he is. For example, during his many exorcisms, Jesus would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. Mark 1:34. In one case, when the demons cry out, "You are the Son of God," Jesus strictly orders them not to make him known. Mark 3:11. After he heals a man of leprosy, he sternly charged him to say nothing to anyone about what had happened. Mark 1:43. Likewise, when he heals the man with a speech impediment, he does so aside from the multitude privately, and then afterward charged them to tell no one. Mark 7:36. When the Apostle Peter confesses Jesus to be the Christ at Caesarea Philippi, Jesus charges the disciples to tell no one about him. Mark 8:30. And after the voice of God identifies Jesus as his beloved Son during the Transfiguration, Jesus commands the disciples to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man should have risen from the dead. Mark 9:9. The secrecy about Jesus' identity is present in all three synoptic Gospels. Why does Jesus do this? Why the secrecy? The Messianic secret. Whole books have been written attempting to explain what scholars have come to refer to as the Messianic secret. Some don't know what to make of Jesus telling everyone to be quiet. If we assume that Jesus came to bring the good news of who he is, then his insistence on silence about his identity and his most memorable miracles seem counterintuitive, to say the least. Others suggest Jesus may have been using reverse psychology. What he really wanted was for his disciples and those he healed to tell everybody. So knowing human nature, he tells them to tell nobody who he is. The result, the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed him. Mark 7:36. But the best explanation is that he is biding his time. Because the truth about his identity is so potentially explosive, Jesus keeps it as secret as possible until the time is right to bring his mission to a climax. In the words of New Testament scholar Craig Keener, at least one important reason, practical strategy, blah, blah, blah. It is difficult to overemphasize the importance of this insight into Jesus' practical strategy for revealing who he is. Many scholars accept the idea that Jesus keeps his messianic identity secret for strategic reasons. However, they often fail to apply the same logic to his divine identity. Again, what's the difference? In short, the reason Jesus does not repeatedly and explicitly proclaim himself to be the Messiah is also the reason Jesus does not repeatedly and explicitly proclaim himself to be divine. Because the truth about his divine identity is even more momentous than his messianic identity. And what, messianic just means anointed one or something? Does that mean anything? During his public ministry, he only speaks about it in riddles until the time has come for him to reveal it fully. Okay, let me skip ahead here, because this is the part I really wanted to get to. The healing of the paralytic. Who can forgive sins but God alone? The first example of how Jesus reveals his divinity comes from one of the first miracles recorded in the Synoptic Gospels, the famous account of the healing of the paralytic. In response to the extraordinary effort of the men who let down their paralyzed friend through the roof, Jesus says and does something even more extraordinary. And when he returned to Capernaum after some days, it was reported that he was at home, and many were gathered together, so that there was no longer room for them, not even about the door. And he was preaching the word to them. And they came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 men. And when they could not get near him because of the crowd, they removed the roof above him, and when they had made an opening, they let down the pallet on which the paralytic lay. And when Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "My son, your sins are forgiven." Now some of the scribes were sitting there questioning in their hearts, "Why does this man speak thus? It is blasphemy. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" And immediately Jesus, perceiving in his spirit that they thus questioned within themselves, said to them, "Why do you question thus in your hearts? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Rise, take up your pallet and walk'? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." He said to the paralytic, "I say to you, rise, take up your pallet and go home." Sounds like they're equally easy. And he rose and immediately took up the pallet and went out before them all, and they were so that they were all amazed and glorified God, saying, "We never saw anything like this." Mark 2, 1-12. All right. I wanted to take this time to talk about Occam's razor. So let's go to another good book. Mine. All right. So basically was going through what can we know with certainty and when are we making assumptions. Basically, the only thing we can know for certain is that I exist. And same for you. The only thing you can know, if you have a thought, you exist. So I exist. Now what? Well, unfortunately, that's as far as we can get with absolute certainty. To believe anything else, we have to start making assumptions. But not all assumptions are created equal. We can reason about potential assumptions to determine whether they might help or hinder us. And that brings us to the first tool in our toolbox, lex parsimoniae, the law of parsimony, more commonly known as Occam's razor. Occam's razor is generally misunderstood as, or misinterpreted as, the simplest explanation is usually right. This tool actually has nothing to do with what is true and what is false. Occam's razor only tells us what we should believe, not what actually is. Occam could care less about reality. He wanted to help us build better models of it in our brains. This is an important distinction because reality is very, very complicated. The simplest explanation isn't usually right, but the simplest explanation is the best explanation to believe. Occam's razor tells us which story we should believe when we can't tell any difference between their outcomes. But if you can't tell the difference between their outcomes, why does it matter which story you believe? We think of a story as a single unit, but they're really made up of many smaller beliefs and assumptions. When a child finds presents beneath the tree on Christmas morning, there are at least two possible stories that fit the observations. One is that Santa Claus rode in a sleigh pulled by flying reindeer and delivered presents all across the world in a single night. The other is that the child's parents bought the presents and put them under the tree. To believe the Santa story, you not only have to believe in Santa, but flying reindeer, elves, an endless toy sack, a fat man squeezing down the chimney, and possibly even faster than light travel. That's a lot of assumptions to add to our belief system, and that's where we can get into trouble. We could start basing new beliefs off those false assumptions without ever testing them, and end up with a whole chain of incorrect beliefs, which could then make us act inappropriately in reality. The most parsimonious explanation is the story that explains all the observations while introducing the fewest new assumptions, and that's the safest story to believe. If we're going to make an error, we should err on the side of disbelief, because it turns out our brains react very differently to different types of errors. All assumptions are not made equal because all mistakes are not made equal, especially not in the human mind. Our brains come with built-in cognitive biases that can blur our image of reality. These are known, proven defects in the way the human mind works. All of us will predictably make these mistakes unless we know enough about them to counter their effects. It turns out that many of our cognitive biases encourage us to form beliefs before we really should. We are pattern seekers. That's what we do. Our brains are always looking for the signal in the noise, and our amplifiers are turned all the way up. Our environment selectively bred us for pattern matching overdrive by killing off our less observant or more skeptical would-be ancestors. Believing things that are false wasn't as dangerous to our ancestors as not believing things that are true. Making more type 1 errors, which is a false positive, than type 2 errors, false negatives, turns out to be a useful trait for survival. Alright, so going back to the paralytic man that Jesus healed, which is more likely, that he actually healed this guy or that he staged the whole thing? It's not that hard to get 4 guys to bring in a guy on a pallet and say, hey, don't move until I say some words, and then when I do, stand up and walk out of here. It's not that hard.